He left me thinking I couldn't have kids. 14 years later, he met our son. The story begins in the warmth of memory, where light spills through linen curtains and golden hours stretch long like summer. Amara and Jason were newlyweds then, young, full of dreams, dancing barefoot in the living room of their first apartment. The floors creaked, the furniture didn't match, and their bank account was often dangerously close to empty, but none of it mattered. In those early days, life felt weightless. Their love was loud, reckless, filled with inside jokes and midnight pancakes. Every morning felt like the start of forever. On the walls hung photos from their rain-soaked wedding day, Amara in a simple white dress, Jason holding an umbrella over her, both of them soaked to the bone but grinning like they held all the joy in the world. They didn't wait for the perfect season or the perfect plan. Love was enough. Always enough. In that tiny home, they began to build not just a life, but a future they could already see so clearly. They whispered about children in between folding laundry and sharing takeout. They picked out baby names and imagined bedtime stories, first days of school, and Sunday mornings with cereal on the floor. Amara kept a notebook by the bed, scribbling down the names they loved, each one a promise, a small star on the horizon they believed they were destined to reach. One day, in quiet anticipation, she bought a baby onesie. Pale green, soft as a sigh, scattered with tiny stars. She didn't tell Jason. It felt sacred, a private offering to the life she believed was just around the corner. She folded it gently and placed it in the bottom drawer of their dresser. It sat there like a secret prayer, waiting to be answered. But time began to shift. Months passed, then more. Each one began with cautious hope, only to end in disappointment. The first time she took a pregnancy test, Amara's heart beat wildly. She lit a candle, held her breath. When the test came back negative, she told herself it was too soon. She tried again the next month. And the next. Hope, at first bold and glowing, began to flicker. Each test line that failed to appear felt like a silent accusation. The once warm home grew quieter. Mornings were no longer filled with laughter, but with unspoken tension. Amara counted days. She charted temperatures. She read articles until her eyes burned. Jason smiled less. He spent more time away, working late, staying out with friends. And when he was home, there was a weight in the air neither of them could name. Doctor visits followed. Blood tests. Examinations. Conversations behind cold desks in sterile rooms. Words like unlikely and low reserve were spoken softly, as if that would make them less cruel. Amara sat there, nodding, asking questions with a voice that didn't sound like her own. On the drive home, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She never told anyone about the moment she broke. Alone in the car, parked beneath a dim streetlight, she screamed into the silence. Not out of anger, but out of grief for a child she hadn't lost, but one she feared she would never meet. The drawer with the tiny green onesie remained closed. The baby name notebook gathered dust. Their conversations changed. They no longer spoke about nurseries or lullabies. They spoke about work, groceries, the weather. Words that filled space but meant nothing. She noticed how he avoided certain topics now, how he winced when friends announced pregnancies, how he looked away when a stroller passed on the sidewalk. There were no fights. Just distance. Just the ache of two people standing next to each other and yet feeling miles apart. Amara tried to hold on to laughter, to dinners together, to movie nights that ended in silence instead of kisses. But the thread between them had frayed. What once felt like a promise now felt like a burden they carried on opposite sides. Jason started sleeping in later, coming home later still. He no longer asked about the test results. He no longer offered reassurances. She began to see it in his eyes, that flicker of something closing off, hardening. And deep down, she knew. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even anger. It was absence. He was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. One quiet morning, she stood in their room, folding laundry. Her fingers brushed the soft green onesie, still at the bottom of the drawer. She hadn't touched it in months. She didn't cry. She just folded it once more, slower this time, and placed it gently back where it had always waited. As she closed the drawer, she realized how long it had been since she believed in that dream. Outside, the world moved on. Birds sang. Cars passed. Somewhere, a baby laughed. But in that apartment, a chapter was quietly coming to an end. The silence between them had become louder than any argument ever could. What began with barefoot dancing and golden light was now a house filled with shadows. Love, once so certain, had been tested, and the cracks had started to show. That was when the dream began to fracture, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly, in the spaces where love used to live. The air in the apartment had changed. It no longer smelled of cinnamon coffee or fresh laundry. It carried instead the stillness of things left unsaid, of conversations abandoned before they ever found words. Amara moved through the space like a ghost, present, but distant. Her days blurred into each other, marked only by the passing sun through the windows and the quiet click of the door when Jason left for work. Or, more and more lately, when he didn't come home until late. Time had begun to rearrange itself. Weeks passed, but it felt like only a few heartbeats since they had been dancing barefoot in this very room. She sometimes found herself reaching back to those memories, not to relive them, but to reassure herself that they had really existed. That they were real. That once, she had been held like something precious. Now, she was only held by routine. She kept herself busy, cleaning, reorganizing, sorting through things that didn't need sorting. There was a need to control something, anything, when everything that had once been stable now sat on a fault line, ready to split. Jason had become more of a shadow than a man. He came and went with mechanical rhythm. He didn't yell. He didn't blame. But the absence of anger was not the presence of love. They drifted past each other like neighbors. His eyes, once full of mischief and warmth, had become tired, unreachable. And Amara, she had grown tired of reaching. The fertility treatments came next. Doctor appointments filled with cold language and sterile optimism. There was a new vocabulary now: follicle counts, hormone levels, ovarian reserve. Words that rolled off medical tongues with ease but landed like weights in Amara's chest. She sat through each appointment with her hands folded tightly in her lap, nodding, always nodding. Jason was there for the first few, sitting beside her, asking questions, taking notes. But as the months dragged on, his presence waned. There was always something: work, exhaustion, meetings he couldn't miss. He began waiting in the car. Then, eventually, not coming at all. And Amara didn't ask him to. She didn't ask anything anymore. Every injection, every test, every timed routine became something she bore alone. The journey toward motherhood, once a shared dream, had become a solitary climb. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was just numb. She stopped keeping the calendar on the fridge, the one that once marked hopeful days with hearts and stars. Now, it was a blank square of white, like the tests that still piled in the bathroom trash. One night, it all came to a quiet head. Amara stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. The reflection didn't look back with hope or defiance, it just watched. Jason walked in, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in weeks, spoke with something close to truth. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just listened, absorbing each word like raindrops soaking into dry soil. He couldn't do it anymore. The trying, the hoping, the not knowing. He missed the version of them that didn't ache. He wanted children, needed them. And somewhere deep down, he had started to believe that wouldn't happen with her. When he said he was leaving, Amara didn't beg. Not because she didn't care, but because she had already lost him a long time ago. This was just the final echo of a goodbye that had been said silently, day by day, in their growing distance. He packed 2 bags. One for clothes, one for memories. She watched him from the hallway, wrapped in a sweater that still smelled like the early days of their love. He didn't look back as he stepped out the door. And she didn't call his name. That night, she stood in the nursery. They had painted it pale yellow once, when hope still colored everything. The walls were empty now, no crib, no mobile, no dreams. Just a rocking chair in the corner, still creaking softly from when she sat in it last. Amara didn't sit. She just stood in the doorway and let the silence fill her ears. There were no witnesses to this heartbreak. No one to see the quiet way a woman grieves a future that never arrived. But in that space, under dim light and the hum of the ceiling fan, something inside her cracked. Not in a way that shattered, but in a way that slowly, painfully made room. She cleaned out the dresser drawers the next morning. The notebook went into a box. So did the onesie. Folded one last time, handled like a memory too delicate to throw away. She didn't burn them. She didn't bury them. She just put them away, somewhere safe, like a photograph you're not ready to look at, but can't bear to lose. The days that followed were both slow and fast. People asked questions. Friends dropped off wine and offered to take her out. She smiled politely. Said she was fine. The kind of fine that comes with swollen eyes and exhausted hands. What they didn't see were the nights. Nights when she lay curled on the bathroom floor, not because she wanted to die, but because she didn't know how to live without the dream she had built her entire world around. Nights when her body felt like a battlefield, and her heart was too heavy to carry. But slowly, something changed. Maybe it was the way the sunlight came through the kitchen window one morning and made the countertop glow. Maybe it was the way the silence began to soften, not into pain, but into peace. Maybe it was just time. But she began to wake up. She started walking again. Around the block. To the cafe. Through the park where children laughed and ran and reminded her that joy still existed in the world, even if it didn't live inside her just yet. She began to paint again. At first, small things, leaves, windows, sky. Then bolder ones. Faces. Women. A mother holding a child she hadn't yet met. The apartment, though still marked by absence, began to feel like hers. Fully hers. No longer a museum of a broken marriage, but a quiet sanctuary where healing could begin. She didn't know what came next. She didn't have a plan. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was drowning in grief. The dream had fractured, yes. But maybe, just maybe, that crack was where the light would eventually pour through. The seasons passed like pages in a book she wasn't sure she wanted to finish. Autumn painted the city in burnt orange and fading gold. Winter dulled the skies to gray, and spring returned with a kind of quiet boldness, pushing green through concrete cracks. Life, indifferent to heartbreak, continued around her. Children grew. Trees bloomed. People fell in love and fell apart. And Amara moved through it all, changed, but still standing. There was no sudden transformation. No dramatic moment when she threw open the curtains and declared herself healed. Instead, there was the slow, faithful process of becoming, of rediscovering the woman she was before everything broke, and learning how to carry the parts that would never fully mend. She had grown quieter, but not small. Her strength wasn't loud, it was enduring, and that strength carried her through the years that followed. She no longer measured her worth by the rhythms of her body. There were no more calendars taped to the fridge, no early morning tests hidden under bathroom towels. The longing remained, yes, but it had softened. It no longer ruled her. It had become something sacred she carried quietly inside. Her art flourished. What began as tentative sketches bloomed into full canvases, messy, vibrant, honest. She painted women with hollow eyes and open hands, children with stars in their hair, families both whole and broken. People began to notice. Galleries called. Her work, once just a whisper of herself, began to speak for others too. One afternoon, in a quiet moment between paintings, Amara sat at her kitchen table, fingers stained with ochre and blue, and felt a stillness she hadn't known in years. It wasn't emptiness, it was space. And in that space, something stirred. The idea came like a breeze through an open window, adoption. It wasn't a lightning strike or a sudden epiphany, just a simple, gentle knowing. She didn't tell anyone at first. She let the thought sit beside her for weeks, testing its weight. It didn't feel like a replacement. It didn't feel like a consolation. It felt like an invitation. And slowly, she accepted. The process was long, complicated, often disheartening. Papers, interviews, home visits. She faced questions that tugged at old scars, about her marriage, her fertility, her ability to love a child not born from her body. But she answered with honesty, with grace, with the quiet fire she had built in the years alone. Then, one day she got the call. His name was Elijah. He had wide eyes, soft curls, and a history already far too heavy for his small frame. He was not a baby. He had seen things, lost things. But so had she. When they met for the first time, neither smiled right away. They just looked at each other. Two strangers orbiting something unfamiliar and fragile. It was not love at first sight. It was something braver. The beginning was hard. There were nightmares, silence, walls built high from years of uncertainty. Elijah didn't trust easily. Amara didn't expect him to. They navigated each other like cautious travelers, slowly mapping the terrain of their new world. But love grew, not in grand declarations, but in the small, everyday things. In bedtime stories and peanut butter sandwiches, in soccer games and long walks where few words were needed. In the quiet moment Elijah reached for her hand without being asked. In the first time he called her mom. That word, so long denied to her, arrived not with fanfare, but with soft, trembling joy. And in that moment, Amara realized the miracle she had stopped believing in had come to her anyway. Not in the way she once imagined, but in the way she needed. Years passed. Elijah thrived. He laughed more, slept better, painted beside her in the studio, where they would listen to old jazz records and sometimes just hum along without knowing the words. He asked questions, deep ones, hard ones, about life, about her, about where he came from. She answered every one. And one day, when he was old enough to understand the shape of her past, she told him the truth. About Jason, about the love that once was, about the life she thought she had lost, and the one that found her instead. He didn't flinch. He didn't pity her. He just listened. And then, in his quiet way, he nodded, as if he already knew. They moved into a new house not long after, one with a garden and creaky stairs and space for the life they had built together. Amara painted the front door yellow, the same soft yellow she once chose for a nursery that never came to be. It felt like a full circle, not a return to the past, but a reclamation of it. She framed the tiny green onesie and hung it in the hallway, not as a relic of loss, but as a testament to hope. Elijah passed it every morning on his way to school, sometimes pausing to touch the frame gently, as if acknowledging all that came before him. One morning, as they sat on the porch watching the world wake up, Elijah leaned against her and asked if she believed things happened for a reason. Amara didn't answer right away. She thought about Jason, about the years she spent aching for a child who never came, about the nights she wept alone, and she thought about Elijah, this beautiful, curious soul who had walked into her life like a second chance. No, she finally whispered, but I believe something beautiful can come out of the things that break us. And in that moment, as the sun rose and the wind stirred the chimes above them, she knew it was true. Because love had returned, not as she once dreamed it, but real and raw and more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. Years had passed. The sharpness of the past had worn down, its edges dulled by time and acceptance. Amara's life was no longer haunted. It was full, textured, real. She had carved something beautiful from the wreckage. Not a fairy tale, no, she no longer chased those, but a quiet, steadfast kind of joy. Elijah was 13 now, tall for his age, kind in a way the world rarely rewards. He had her eyes, though they shared no blood. People said so often. Maybe because they looked for it, the resemblance, trying to make sense of what love had made real. And in a way, he had become a mirror. In him, Amara saw not only her growth, but her survival. Their home was calm that morning. Amara was watering her garden, fingers buried in the earth, lost in the slow rhythm of planting. Elijah was in the garage with his brushes and paints. Saturdays were their sacred days, unrushed, unbothered, full of shared silence. Then came the knock. 3 soft raps on the front door. Not urgent, not impatient, just unexpected. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door, expecting a neighbor. A package, something mundane. But when she opened it, time stuttered. Jason stood there, older, weathered, not unrecognizable, but changed. His hair was flecked with gray. His posture was less certain, as though life had pressed heavily into his shoulders over the years. He looked up at her slowly, like a man approaching sacred ground with muddy feet. For a moment, neither spoke. There are reunions that are loud. Tears, accusations, confusion. This wasn't that. This was something stranger. A reunion with a ghost who suddenly had breath again. Amara's breath caught, not out of pain or love, but from the shock of memory given form. Jason's eyes searched her face, and then, without preamble, he whispered her name. Not a plea, not a claim, just recognition, as if saying it aloud might confirm she was real. She didn't invite him in. Not right away. They stood there in the doorway, the years stretched out between them like a canyon. And she realized something remarkable. Her heart wasn't racing. It was still, steady, ready. He had come, he said, because he'd heard. He'd seen an article, her painting, her gallery opening. The interviewer had asked about motherhood. She had spoken about Elijah, briefly, carefully, and somehow Jason had read it, had followed the thread. And here he was. I didn't know, he said. I saw his picture. His voice cracked. Amara didn't answer. She didn't know him that. He asked, gently, if he could meet him. And there, something inside her shifted. Elijah. She turned slowly, her voice still even, and asked Jason to wait. She found Elijah sitting cross-legged on the floor of the garage, headphones on, brush in hand. He looked up and smiled. Easy, innocent, untouched by the storm brewing outside. Amara sat beside him, placed a hand on his show. Someone from before. Elijah tilted his head, curious but unafraid. Is it someone who hurt you? He asked, with quiet clarity. Amara paused. He did. Once. but not in the way you think. And not anymore. Elijah thought for a moment, then stood. He followed her to the porch. Jason stood as they approached, hands shaking. His eyes locked on Elijah's, and something flickered across his face, recognition. The kind that doesn't need blood. The kind that sees truth anyway. For a long moment, no one spoke. Elijah looked at him, studied him, and then, softly, he said, "You're my mom's past, aren't you?" Jason blinked, stunned. Amara's breath caught again, but she didn't interrupt. Jason nodded. "Yes, I am." Elijah nodded, too. "Okay." He didn't run to him, didn't ask questions. He just looked at his mother, then back at Jason, and said, "Do you want to sit with us for a little?" So they did. On the porch, with lemonade and quiet tension between sips. Jason told them where he'd been, how he had remarried, divorced, tried to start over and failed, how regret was a constant echo, how seeing Elijah's photo had undone something in him he thought he buried. Amara listened, not to forgive, but to understand. Jason asked questions about Elijah's life, his passions, his dreams. He didn't call himself anything. He didn't ask to be a father. He didn't even ask to stay. He simply bore witness to the life he had once walked away from. And as the sky turned lavender and gold, Elijah asked if he could show Jason the studio. Amara nodded, and the two disappeared inside. She stayed on the porch, heart full and aching. She didn't know what this was. A reckoning? A healing? A thread reconnecting to a frayed part of the past? Maybe all of it. Maybe none. But she knew one thing for certain. She was not the same woman he had left. She had broken. She had rebuilt. And what stood now was stronger, deeper, more whole than she had ever been back then. Jason left before dusk. There was no promise to return. No declaration of redemption. Just a handshake from Elijah, a long look between him and Amara, and a quiet thank you. That night, Elijah sat beside her on the couch, legs tucked beneath him. "He seemed sorry," he said. "He was," Amara replied. "But sometimes sorry isn't about fixing. It's just about facing." Elijah nodded again, wise beyond his years. Then he looked at her and said, "I'm glad I'm yours." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She just held him close, her arms wrapping around the miracle she never expected, the life she had chosen, the love she had earned. And outside, the stars began to pierce the sky, silent, steady, and watching. Weeks passed. Life had a curious way of stitching itself back together after even the strangest interruptions. The porch meeting with Jason hadn't broken anything, but it had shifted the air, like the faint scent of rain long after the storm. Not dangerous. Not even unwelcome. Just present. Amara continued with her routines, early mornings in the studio, coffee warming her palms, Elijah's laughter echoing from the kitchen. But under the rhythm of her days, a question pulsed. What now? Jason had not returned. He hadn't called, hadn't written. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed. It was hard to admit, even to herself, that a part of her had expected more. Closure, perhaps. Or a deeper reckoning. But maybe that wasn't how stories ended. Maybe some threads just fray and fade. Elijah was quieter, too. Not in a fearful way, but thoughtful. He began to ask questions, subtle at first. About where Jason had gone after he left. About what made someone give up. About the weight people carry and the choices they make under it. Amara answered him with the truth, shaped carefully not to protect Jason, but to protect Elijah's growing heart. He wasn't ready to be the kind of person who stays, she said one night, while folding laundry under the amber kitchen light. And sometimes, people run before they know what they've left behind. Elijah nodded, thoughtful. Then he looked up. "Do you think he wants to stay now?" She didn't answer right away. The truth was, she didn't know. And the deeper truth was, it wasn't her decision anymore. One rainy Sunday, as thunder rolled low in the distance, Elijah approached her with something folded in his hands, a letter. Ink-smudged. Careful lines. He had written to Jason. "I didn't tell him everything," Elijah said. "I steady. Just what I wanted him to know." Amara took the letter and held it with trembling fingers. She didn't read it. She didn't ask to. She simply nodded and promised to send it. The post office was quiet. She dropped the envelope into the slot, listening to the soft metallic echo as it disappeared into the unknown. She stood there for a long while, her hands still hovering over the chute. The weight of the past, and the hope inside her son's letter, settled heavily in her chest. 3 days later, Jason replied. His letter was humble, measured, filled with apologies that didn't ask for anything in return. He told Elijah that he hadn't earned the right to be called Dad, and maybe never would, but that he was proud of the boy he'd become. He thanked Amara, not for forgiving him, but for raising someone so extraordinary. And then came something unexpected. "I'd like to visit again," he wrote, "if it's okay. Just for a little while. I understand if not." Amara read the words over and over. She didn't answer right away. She let the decision settle in the quiet corners of her mind as the days turned cooler and the leaves outside began their slow golden descent. Elijah, to her surprise, didn't hesitate. "I think I want to see him again," he said simply. So they invited him for dinner. One meal. No expectations. Just a table between them. Jason arrived holding a bottle of wine and a bouquet of soft wildflowers. Sun-drenched and a little unruly, like something that belonged in Amara's studio. He didn't try to hug Elijah. Didn't overstep. He just sat down and listened. Dinner was awkward, but warm. Elijah talked about school, about a poem he was writing. Jason listened intently, genuinely. He asked about art, about music, about the little details of Elijah's life with the kind of attention that spoke volumes. Amara watched them from across the table, two people tethered not by biology, but by something messier and more fragile: history, chance, choice. Later, as Jason stood to leave, he turned to her, not with hope, but with gratitude. "I never stopped loving you," he said, softly, "but I see now. I didn't know how to love the way you needed, the way he needed. I'm sorry it took me this long." Amara's eyes didn't fill with tears. She didn't reach for him. She didn't need to. Because this time, the apology wasn't a wound reopened. It was a final stitch in a scar that had already healed. She nodded, gently. Outside, Elijah stood by the porch, watching the stars rise. Jason stepped beside him. "Thank you for the letter," he said. Elijah glanced up. "I wanted you to know who I am. I'm grateful I got to." A pause. "Do you think we could start again?" Jason asked. Just slowly. Elijah didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small shell, smooth, blue-gray, worn from years, in his treasure box. "I found this the day Mom adopted me," he said. "It's lucky." He placed it in Jason's hand. Jason's breath hitched. He nodded, said nothing, and left with the shell clutched gently, as if it might break. That night, Amara stood at her window, watching the moonlight spill across the kitchen tiles. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether Jason would return, whether Elijah's heart would open further or close again. But she knew this. She had raised a boy full of grace, a boy unafraid of the past, a boy who had taken pain and turned it into a bridge. And she, Amara, had found a kind of peace not in the undoing of the past, but in accepting it, in growing something new from it, in loving without conditions, without need, just because love was still possible. Because in the end, love doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it returns quietly, like a knock at the door, like a letter in the mail, like a shell passed from one hand to another, not to fix what was broken, but to honor that it happened and still, somehow, to choose forward. Autumn deepened. The days turned cooler, wind sweeping dried leaves across sidewalks like scattered memories. Life, in its persistent way, continued: school runs, studio hours, quiet dinners, and long walks in the woods behind their house where Elijah liked to collect fallen branches and reshape them into sculptures. But now, there was a new rhythm, one cautious, almost imperceptible. Jason had begun to visit, never without invitation. Sometimes for dinner, sometimes for a Sunday coffee. Always polite, always aware of the line he had once crossed and the space he now tread. He never overstayed, never pressed. And in that restraint, he began to earn something he had long forfeited: trust, not of the past, but of the present. Amara watched it happen slowly. The awkward pauses between him and Elijah became full conversations. Questions turned into shared laughs. And once, in the soft light of a Saturday afternoon, she walked into the garage to find them both at the workbench, Jason handing Elijah a small box of screws while the boy explained his latest sculpture. No labels, no roles, just people, trying. That night, she sat at her easel long after Elijah had gone to bed. Her brush hovered above the canvas, but she didn't paint. She was remembering the way Jason used to sit just like that, shoulder hunched, listening, trying to belong to a world he never fully understood. She wondered if it was time to forgive him, not for his sake, for hers, because holding on to the pain had protected her for so long. But maybe now, it was just weighing her down. One morning, not long after, Elijah brought home a school assignment. Write about a turning point in your life. He asked Amara if he could write about her, about being adopted. About Jason. She hesitated. It's your story, she said finally. You can tell it how you lived it. So he did. The essay was raw and kind. It spoke of confusion, of longing, of feeling whole in a way he never expected. It didn't villainize Jason, but it didn't romanticize him either. I met him once, Elijah wrote, as a shadow. And years later, I met him again, as a person. He's not my father in the way some people have fathers. But he's someone I now know. And I think that's something. The teacher asked to publish it in the school's annual anthology. When it was printed, Amara kept a copy on her nightstand. One evening, weeks later, Jason came over with something different in his hands. Not flowers, not wine. A photo album. Old, worn, the leather soft at the edges. He placed it on the kitchen table. These were ours, he said softly. Inside were pictures of a life Amara had buried. Their wedding. Their first apartment. A blurry ultrasound, barely visible. Images frozen in time, full of hope and innocence. I found it in storage, Jason said. Thought you should have it. She opened the album carefully, fingers brushing across the photographs like they might crumble under touch. There was a silence that stretched between them, not empty, but full, like they were standing together in a room built entirely out of memory. When she looked up, Jason wasn't watching her. He was watching Elijah, who was laughing in the next room, playing music, tapping a rhythm on the wall. He's everything I wasn't, Jason said quietly. Because of you. Amara said nothing, but something in her chest softened. Maybe it was time. Not to forget. Never that. But to release the version of Jason that had abandoned her, and see the man who had returned, older, humbled, no longer running. That weekend, Elijah asked if Jason wanted to come to his school's art show. Jason hesitated. Are you sure? Elijah nodded. It's open to everyone. The school gym was bright, buzzing with noise and energy. Elijah's piece, a tall, twisting structure made of wood, wires, and melted glass, stood near the back wall. He called it Reshape. The description read, sometimes things don't break, they just become something else. Jason stood in front of it for a long time, not speaking, just taking it in. Later, as they left the building, he turned to Amara. You did right by him, he said. Her eyes met his. We did. And maybe that was the truth of it. Because Jason had given her nothing back then. But he had given her the absence that became space. The pain that forged resilience. The silence that forced her to find her voice. And Elijah, he was the result of every shattered dream that had been picked up, piece by piece, and reshaped into something whole. Weeks passed. Jason remained in their lives, carefully, slowly. Not as a father. Not even yet as a friend. But as a man learning to show up. And Amara, she painted again. Not from pain, but from peace. Her canvases were full of light now. Of trees bending gently in the wind. Of rivers flowing around obstacles. Of bridges, delicate, imperfect, but standing. One night, Elijah asked her, do you think people really change? Amara smiled. Not always. But they can choose differently. He nodded, content with that. Outside, the wind had stilled. The house was quiet. And somewhere, between memory and forgiveness, between grief and grace, Amara knew they were not who they had been. Not broken, not defined by loss, but redefined. By choice, by courage, by love, not perfect, but true. And the story was still unfolding. Winter came gently that year. Snow blanketed the city in stillness. The world seemed quieter, slower, as if the earth itself had paused to breathe. Inside Amara's home, the warmth of life pulsed steadily, candlelight flickered on windowsills, the scent of cinnamon and pine drifted through the air, and the sounds of a soft jazz record filled the silence in all the right places. Elijah was now 14, taller, with a thoughtful calm in his eyes that didn't quite match his age. He had grown not just in years, but in grace, and in truth. Jason had become something of a fixture, though still carefully, like a guest learning how to enter a home without knocking too hard. He came for Elijah's poetry readings, for the occasional weekend brunch, for moments that mattered, but never expected more than was given. Amara had made peace with his presence. The man who once disappeared had re-entered not as a missing puzzle piece, but as a story she could now read without flinching. One afternoon, Amara stood by the studio window, watching Elijah and Jason build a snow lantern in the backyard. The air was crisp, and their laughter floated through the frost like a memory arriving early. She sipped her tea and smiled, not from nostalgia, but from contentment. This was not the life she had dreamed, no, but it was the one she had built. With both hands, with open eyes. And it was good. That evening, Elijah pulled out the old photo album, the one Jason had returned months ago, and asked if they could go through it together. They sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a fire crackling nearby. The pages turned softly beneath their fingers, each photo a window into a life that once was. There was one photo, Amara in a sunlit field, barefoot and smiling, a hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. Elijah touched the image carefully. "That's me, right?" She nodded. "Before I even knew you." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think I was always meant to be here?" She looked at him, not just her son, but her mirror, her echo, her proof. "I think love always finds a way," she said, "even when we can't see it coming." He smiled, then leaned his head against her shoulder. That night, Amara found herself alone in the studio again. The moonlight spilled across the floor like paint. On her easel sat a canvas she'd begun weeks ago, an abstract landscape in soft blues and golds. Half finished, unrushed. She picked up her brush. Each stroke was a choice, a breath, a release. In the quiet of that room, she painted not the past, not even the future, but the present. The beauty of what remains, the strength in what continues, the delicate, imperfect grace of lives intertwined and healed in their own time. A few days later, on New Year's Eve, Amara hosted a small gathering, just a few friends, Elijah and Jason. It wasn't grand. No fireworks, no loud celebration. Just soft lights, warm drinks, and laughter echoing in a space that once held silence. At midnight, they stepped outside to watch the city lights flicker on the horizon. Elijah stood between them, a hand in each of theirs. No words were needed, because sometimes the greatest triumph is not a grand declaration, but the quiet, steady hum of resilience, of relationships rebuilt, of trust reimagined. Later, after the guests had left and the night had quieted, Amara stood at the window one last time. She thought of all the versions of herself she had been. The hopeful bride, the grieving woman, the quiet warrior, the mother, the artist, the forgiver. And now, just Amara, whole, still healing, always becoming. She turned off the light. In the darkness, the house breathed. And in that silence, full and kind, her story rested, no longer in fragments, but finally in peace.